Live streaming is a
All right, I guess it started.
Awesome.
So what were you asking?
Let's see. So we talked about the model of, I guess, a student leading a group or kind of serving as a mentor for other students, perhaps someone who's a little bit further along in a course, but not, not necessarily someone with 15 years of experience in a topic. And we've seen that work really well. There are times when it scales really well. There are times when it doesn't scale as well. I think as you've mentioned, the quality control becomes really important because not every person is suitable or good at that necessarily, and that's okay. Um, but yeah, I think the model itself is interesting and totally viable. And then my question was, in which scenarios, in which institutions or where would you be applying that, do you think?
For example, there are things in design where feedback really matters, and perspectives of different people helps a lot. And in places like design, I actually randomly struck on design, and
Hmm.
so I was trying to experiment with what I learned, but I thought that let's try a different stream of thinking. And randomly, after seeing the results, I actually figured out that it actually works better in design.
Hmm.
And
What are you seeing in design? I mean, I guess in design, it feels like the amount of feedback is probably one of the most important things, right? Getting somebody else's eyes on what you're doing. But that's fascinating. What have you learned within design?
what if you?
What have you learned watching it applied within design?
Yeah. So the thing is, if you are having a discussion with peer group, or for example, when founders have discussions with users, the users are not necessarily expert in the product, but they give unique insights to the founders who are, you know, experts. I hope in the product. And so that's the thing with people who are trying to learn design. It doesn't necessarily have to be right just within the peer group. You can also learn from other people, have request feedback from others who are, you know, far ahead of you. And we also have
Hmm.
sessions with, the masters of the subjects who come in like, give YC talks or talks like that, and give feedback to you know the students.
Fascinating. Yeah, it reminds me almost of um, at one company I worked at, we used a site, was I think it was called usertesting.com a lot. And that was testing specific, but the idea of being able to rapidly gain feedback from a targeted audience is super valuable, especially, I mean, if you're a startup, one of the hardest things is there's not always somebody there to give you feedback, right? Like now that Bloom Tech is a little bit bigger, I'm never suffering for lack of feedback. It's all, there's too much feedback, if anything, and it's a matter of sorting it. But when you're first getting started, it's really difficult to engage, to intentionally gauge enough people. Um, so would you be building a product around that process, or would you building a school with it, or where do you think it goes?
I think it can go in the direction where people can request rapid feedback from people who are either learning with learning in the same direction or a few steps ahead of them, and we can build a sort of so I also believe in this thing that small communities perform better than large communities, and that holds especially true and is proven in learning. So we can move in a general action of structuring learning communities who can learn from each other, and with a special focus on rapid feedback. And rapid feedback to a learner who is beginning to learn something helps propel them much further than they can ever go.
Interesting. And you mentioned design. I'm curious how you stumbled into that as as a first place to apply kind of those methodologies. Are, are you a designer yourself, or did you just like what? How did you even take that first step?
So I worked with Walter Bender, who is the former director of MIT Media Lab, on Sugar Labs, which branched off from One Laptop a Child project. And so he was the one of the finest designers I know, and he also one of the finest, people in the education sector I know. So I figured out that if there's some, kind of advice I need to lean on, I'd probably, ask for advice from him. And
Interesting.
it turned out that design actually performs better in this structure than I ever hoped it would.
Tell me more. What do you mean by that? What did you find?
So, for example, from a programmer background, if you need to learn, you look at. So, there was a post on Hacker News that after I started all this, I read a post on Hacker News that someone was learning from Git commit messages of open source projects to learn how to program. And I was fascinated that, oh my God, this is exactly what I'm doing in design. And this is also exactly how I learned deep learning and other stuff. So that's something I think can be applied to a lot of other fields. And
So,
it's
so how are they learning from Git messages? Were they just submitting pull requests and seeing why something was accepted or rejected, or what were they learning?
so they're seeing what pull requests were accepted and or rejected, and reading the Git commit messages of them, and
Hmm.
then figuring out what are the things that the maintainer wants, and they're targeting specifically language or library uh, GitHubs where
Hmm.
frameworks around that and experts of that framework hang out. So it was an
Interesting.
interesting model to learn things.
So practically, when you're doing it with design, what's the user experience actually like?
So the user experiences, people hang out in a small group of less than 30 people, and the lesser the better actually, and but no more than 30 or 50 people. And people post something that they have designed, the first iteration, and then the group as a whole, or the people who are actively learning, they they push towards push feedback for the second iteration, and then the person gives a second iteration, and they you know point feedback. And if the person wants to develop a third iteration, they give more feedback, and that's how the thing evolves.
Interesting. One of the things that I think would make design marginally more tricky, and I'm sure you've thought about this and probably answered this question before, but how do you deal with it when feedback is bad, or if it's wrong, as an example? I mean, in programming, it's a little more straightforward because if the code runs, the code runs. Whereas design, it can be more subjective. As I guess as a student who's going through that, how am I able to differentiate between good advice and bad advice?
How are you as a founder, or anyone as a founder, differentiate between bad advice from users?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually. And I think at the end of the day, and not just from users, right? But like from investors, from board members, like some amount is going to be right and some amount is going to be wrong. And often you can only really learn through experience. But I think that's that's why I asked the question, because oftentimes when people talk about getting feedback or getting advice, there's some sort of built-in assumption that the advice will be good or right or valuable or something. That's not always the case, right? Um, I think one of the more visible areas that I've seen, when Facebook moved away from the wall, it wasn't, a lot of people internally hated the idea a lot of users hated the idea. And Facebook made the decision to basically queue off of metrics as opposed to what people were saying. And it doesn't matter what you say. What I'm going to listen to is what the numbers say. But in design specifically, I'm curious how you think about that.
So the thing about designers is we do have some experts in the group, by the way. But the thing with design is that you eventually have to deal with real people who are not an expert in design,
Mm-hmm.
and to figure out figure out the part that's bad advice or bad design, and to shaft it out like weed and shaft. You need to do that, and so people learn how to. Uh, and the people who are giving advice are also learning how to give better feedback to their peers. So uh, that's almost how founders figure out bad advice from good advice.
Yeah, and I think that's how really everybody has to figure out what advice is good and bad. I was curious if there are any hacks that you've seen or any shortcuts to that. There may it may just be human nature, to figure out what voices to listen to. That's really interesting.
So the hacks basically are that you are the prime you have the prime minimal of your users, and you eventually need to learn how to separate good advice from bad advice, because you know your users and no one
Mm-hmm.
else. So that's something that needs to be instilled. And in design, the user is the prime person you need to cater to, and they can be experts who will give bad advice. So you also need to figure that out.
Yeah, totally. That seems like it's just a core human skill to
Yeah,
learn, I
just like
guess.
real world learning.
Yeah. So practically, let's see, you're putting groups of, we'll call it 30 designers together. I'm sure the number varies, and you mentioned some hesitancy to have the group above a certain end. I think 30 or 50 or something like that. Um, and then is it kind of message board style? If I have requests for feedback, I post something, and then other people reply in thread to that kind of idea.
Right. So a lot of large companies in India started based off WhatsApp groups, and even though I know how to build a uh, you know app or website first, I figure out that the easiest way to test this assumption out was to build a WhatsApp group and just let it learn and run according to what I want the product to be. And so I've been hosting these impact sessions and scoring, like who learns whose designs are getting better every week, and the scoreboard type things, and also doing live streams with experts, and also have a few experts in the group already. So that's how the image
Interesting.
looks like.
Yeah, WhatsApp is actually probably a
Interestingly,
really
people
good
have
place to
got
start.
jobs in great design companies. So I was in a short span of time.
Very cool. Yeah, it makes sense. How many people do you have using it right now? Is it kind of you're in alpha with 100 users or something like that? Sorry, I think that's my son knocking on the
Yeah, it's
door. Ignore that sound.
no worries. Yeah, it's just one group. I was testing it, but I guess now it's time to scale it a bit and test it on a larger user base.
Yeah, it's super cool.
So
Sorry,
we
one
should
second.
probably, yeah. Your kids are awesome. I keep seeing the pictures on Twitter and about them.
Yeah, my son recently figured out that he can come knock on my door, and if he knocks loud enough, it's really hard to ignore him. So we'll have to figure that one out in the long run. But they're great. Just more distractions of working at home, you know?
Yeah, so we wanted to talk about Bloom Tech and how do you see, like, or what do you see of ICS now, income share agreements?
Yeah, I think ISAs are in an interesting spot from a regulatory standpoint and just what the industry has learned about them over time. So, I can only speak for our experience and for the experience of other schools. ISAs work really well if a student is willing to put in the work. And what a lot of schools that use ISAs are seeing is that isn't necessarily always the case, and that in some extremes, ISAs can attract people who aren't, there's always like the selection bias problem of, if I'm not serious, then I'll take out an ISA, and if it doesn't work out, then I don't care. So that next level of commitment is something that we've been trying to solve for, so I'll talk about that for just a minute, and then we can talk about kind of the regulatory standpoint. So if we have a student who is graduated and will do the very basic stuff that we know needs to happen in order for somebody to get a job, they'll get it almost 100% of the time. Not, I'm sure there are edge cases and asterisks on that statement, but by and large, if a student is willing to do what we recommend, they get hired. And we found that a lot of our difficulty was post-graduation encouraging students to do those very basic things, especially if you graduate and you want to take a week off because you're burned out, and then you don't really get ramped back up the next week, and then with every passing day it gets a little bit harder to jump back in, and so that's been pretty tricky. And then from a regulatory standpoint, more folks are starting to consider ISAs as loans, which doesn't really make sense, honestly. It's just so different than a loan that you can, kind of work it backwards so that so the regulator feels like it's a loan, but it was originally meant to be, a short-term equity agreement, like based on earnings, not, I think we put a cap on ours, and we emphasized the earnings cap to make it even more student friendly than it perhaps ought to have been, honestly. And then regulators see the cap as the tuition amount, and anything different from the cap they see the cap as the amount that students will pay, even though not anywhere near every student pays the cap. And then they see whatever your tuition amount is as tuition, and anything between the tuition amount and the cap they call interest. Now that doesn't really make sense, because if you're a student who makes more money, you pay more money, which means you'll pay it off faster. And then regulators would say, oh well, that's a really high interest rate because they're paying more and they're paying off their loan fast, and it just doesn't make sense. I mean, in some instances, according to that methodology, we have a negative interest rate, and that's not a thing. So our outcomes-based loan is taking our knowledge about ISAs and building it into a loan product. So what was really important to students was keeping the monthly payment as low as possible. Obviously, the total amount that they have to pay back, keeping that as low as possible. And then, if it doesn't work out, not having to pay anything. So between our tuition refund guarantee, which says, if you do these things and don't find a job, we'll not only give you a full refund, but we'll actually pay you extra on top of that. And building the outcomes-based loan on the back of a loan where if you don't get hired, you still get a refund. I think we're able to kind of make everything meet together, but we'll have to see how that goes.
And how are you checking for the selection bias that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so all of our ISAs have a deposit or a small upfront down payment. So that filters for some level of seriousness in a way that, we've tried a million things and nothing quite was ever quite as effective as somebody, even if a student puts $1 down or $100 down, their level of commitment is much greater than if they put $0 down. And then with the outcomes-based loan, in order to get the refund, you have to actually do the work. So if you don't, look for a job, then that's fine, and you'll just have to make payments on the loan. So it's up to you. Would you rather look for a job or make payments on the loan? I'm sure everybody will actually look for a job because that's the point of being there. But there's, I guess, some extrinsic motivation where before there wasn't. So yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Right. And I guess our time is running up now. And do you have, is it a hard deadline? Can I ask you a few more questions?
Yeah, I've got a hard stop, unfortunately. But
Oh,
yeah, it was really good chatting and saying hello. I'm fascinated by what you're doing. I'll have to check it out.
thanks, Allred. Thanks for coming in. Thanks, Austen. Bye.
Awesome. Have a good one.
Bye.